Okay. So good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining me. I will talk about our different projects on oaks, and it is important to mention that this is not a sort of an ongoing project that one step follows another step, but rather different pieces of evidence from different projects that I try to put together to get to a bigger picture and get some understanding of the threats of oaks in Israel. And so I would welcome any comment or any insight that you might have from what I'm going to tell you. What we see here on this picture is one of the southernmost oaks in Israel, or let's say one of an oak in one of the driest regions where oaks still grow in Israel. So we're talking today about one species, and this is Quercus caliprinos, alon matsui. I'm not going to talk about any other oak species. This species might be a separate one or a subspecies of the Mediterranean Quercus coquifera. I'm not going to get into this, but I will mention coquifera later. So just that you know that some researchers do not relate to Quercus caliprinos as a separate species. Now, this species is very important, like in other Mediterranean type regions, such as California, as you can see in the poster down on the left side. Very important for animals as a habitat, important for humans as providing ecosystem services. And this is the area more or less where Quercus caliprinos grows in Israel. And I will relate among another place to the southern edge, which is one of the which is actually one of the climatic edges of oak distribution. So we have to relate to climate change. And in this context, what is important to talk about is that part of climate change, there is an expansion of the tropical belt further north and further south of the equation. And this leads to drier conditions in the subtropical belt here. And further in the semi-arid regions polewards of this subtropical dry belts, including the Mediterranean basin. Now, this has consequences for this dry edge of the oak distribution that I showed before. And this is a slide from Baruch Ziv, Evrat Sheffer, and colleagues, where they showed that the SI, which is the seasonality index, increases in this southern region. And this is statistically significant exactly in the region that one of the regions that I'm going to talk about. The seasonality index means that rain is more concentrated in 3 months, December, January, February, and less dispersed over the other seasons like October, November, or March, April, and so on. And this can be related and is often related to increased drought. And this exactly comes from what I talked before about the expansion of the tropical belt, etc. So it's going to be drier in this already dry region. And now what are the consequences, the potential consequences for oak distribution or the cover of oak in where they grow? And this now refers to Quercus coquifera in the Middle East. And these are projections according to the high emission scenario by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, this high emission scenario, unfortunately, is a realistic scenario. And so for the years 2050 and 2070, using 3 different models, they show that there's going to be loss of oak cover all over the region. Green is stable and blue is gain, but we see that in many regions there is a loss of oak cover being projected. So with this as a background, the aims of this research project, or these different research projects, are to assess the vulnerability of Quercus caliprinus trees to climate change under field conditions, and to test ways to mitigate drought stress and potential mortality of this key species in Mediterranean woodlands. And the research approach is to use natural field sites for these oak trees, which are marginal in terms of water availability for thriving of the trees. And so these sites serve as case studies to examine the effect of drought and potential mitigation measures on oak trees. Now, I will always talk about oak now, but mean this one species and not any other species that grow in Israel. The research outline. So one is assessment of vulnerability of oak trees to drought, and this work has been done in Ramat HaNadiv, which is a lithology-based edge of oak distribution. So it is a more moist region, but the bedrock and the soil do not allow a lot of oaks to grow there. We will look into long-term monitoring of oak trees, into water use of trees that vary, that are variably affected by drought, and we will compare Quercus caliprinus with other woody species about their drought resistance strategy. And then the second topic is livestock grazing as a potential tool of drought stress mitigation. And there, the field sites are in the southern Judean foothills, which I indicated before as a climate-based edge of oak distribution. Here we will look into a long-term grazing experiment and into an additional experimental setup using different sites. And you see that already that to get the ecological insights, the term long-term appears here twice. So we need long-term studies to get an understanding of what's going on in the field. So the first topic, you can see here a map of Ramat HaNadiv, and you can also see that oaks, these green dots, appear only in very specific areas in this entire region. And this is a consequence of the lithology-based constrictions that these trees have. Now, the questions that we asked are, how do oaks respond to annually varying drought intensity? And the prediction was that the more intense the drought, the more pronounced the degeneration and the mortality of oaks. Pretty straightforward. And this work is, so we did long-term monitoring of oak trees, looked, and I will present crown condition and mortality rates. And this work is being conducted by El Navon from Ramat HaNadiv Nature Park in collaboration with us. Here's the precipitation record of the last 25 years, which show rather dry 10 years here until a few years ago, with a very dry year in 2014, where we only had about 50% of the mean annual precipitation, then a wet year, and recently a few wetter years, with this year being probably more or less average. So we will look into these monitoring years here between 2011 and 2020. And first have a look at mortality rates. And this was a surprise to me, we have mortality rate on the y-axis and the annual precipitation on the x-axis, and we see a linear increase of mortality with a decrease in annual precipitation. Now, it was a surprise to me because I thought that this is going to be much more complicated, that there are going to be legacy effects of one dry year into the next dry year, that maybe not only the amount of rainfall, but its distribution and so on and so forth might be important, or maybe even temperature, which might make a year drier as compared to another year. But no, it seems that the water availability in this specific year drives the mortality rate, or at least most of it. We see an R square of 95%. And by the way, this is a dead oak tree here. We see some greenery here, but this is because of climbers and because of other shrubs occupying this space with time. What about the conditions of the trees? And we use visual measures of the tree condition. You on the top see a tree in a good condition, which has a dense canopy or a dense crown, and on the bottom here, a highly stressed plant, which has a very low crown density. And so what you see here is crown density on the y-axis and during a few years, and the lines represent individual trees. Actually, the change from one year to the next year. And the red lines are a decrease in crown density, the blue lines are increase, and the black lines are unchanged. And you can immediately see that from the normal or average year 2013 to the very dry year of 2014, 70% of the trees reduced their crown density. And actually the next year it rebounds. 70% of the trees increased their crown density in 2015, which was a very wet year. So this is a very plastic response. We see some outliers. I mean, even in this wet year, some trees died and got to zero crown density, so no leaves anymore, and they did not rebound. They did not come back in the next year. Even here, all these trees that died in 2014 or lost all their leaves in 2014 did not resprout in 2015, although this was a wet year. So there is a lot of plasticity, but it seems that most trees, at least in this region, do not resprout once they lose all their leaves. So crown density adjustment seems to be very important, and this is after a very long dry season where the first rain came only in December, and we see that trees just dropped their leaves, even did not induce senescence of leaves. So they dropped, they just dry their leaves and they stay green rather than being brown. And this is a very extreme response to drought, but this is how this species seems to function. So this was our question: how do oaks respond to annually varying drought intensity? And the findings were that oak mortality in Ramat HaNadiv is linearly and inversely related to annual rain amounts. And the response of surviving oaks to drought is plastic and manifests itself in an adjustment of the crown density, that is the transpiring tree leaf area. And this is to annual water availability. Now, we then asked, how is the adjustment of crown density actually regulated? And predicted that the more intense the stress level experienced by a tree, the lower its water potential, the lower its crown density, its stomatal conductance, and in the end, its water use. So we made an assessment of the water use of trees that were variably affected by drought, but actually that had that have different or very different crown densities. We group them into different stress classes, 1, 2, 3, 4, with 1 being non-stress trees and 4 being very stressed trees. And this is work by our then Finnish student Päivi Venänen and some work by Jakia Preisler. And this is in collaboration with Volcani Center. What we see here is plant activity and water potential during different seasons in these 4 stress classes. And we can immediately see that there's not much difference actually between these stress classes in pre-dawn water potential. Now, pre-dawn water potential on the one hand gives us an indication of the water availability in the soil, but also an indication of the water status of the tree. So for each season, there was no statistically significant difference between the stress classes, but we can still see that possibly if we look across all the seasons, stress class 4 has a bit lower water potential in most of these months. Stomatal conductance, though, there was not much difference. It was also very similar. In some of the months, even there were higher stomatal conductance in the more stressed trees. And this here shows the relationship between stomatal conductance and the water potential, here now inverse positive. And we see that the stress classes, stress class 4, has higher water potential, higher stomatal conductance at low water potential, but then it decreases more pronouncedly when water potential gets low. So from -1 to -5 as compared to the other stress classes. So in 2013, as I mentioned, it was a very long dry season with green leaves being dropped to reduce the transpiring leaf area. And so this is the pre-dawn water potential versus the crown density at this time. And we see a very slight decrease in water potential with a decrease in crown density, but this is not statistically significant, and actually it seems very actually very stable. Although we have a tree with 100% crown density and 2 trees with 5%, but still something might be going on here in terms of the water potential, which could be a threshold that once it's being passed, the trees might not recover. And indeed, this tree here with the black symbol later died and did not recover anymore. Regarding water use, we had a small study on where we automatically monitor tree water use of non-stressed and stressed trees. This was the non-stressed tree, and this was a moderately stressed tree. And we used heat dissipation sensors to monitor sap flow, so the water moving in the xylem from the roots to the canopy, and point hydrometers to measure the changes in the diameter of the bark and of the xylem, which gives us an indication to water storage in the stem. And what we can see here is the sap flow between April and October 2016. And now watching the non-stressed tree in blue, we see that it has a maximum here in the morning in April, and a similar pattern in May. So the x-axis is the time during the day, and then in June it starts to decrease a bit, but still it has a sort of a normal distribution, which went on also in July. in August, September, just slowly reducing the flow of water in the xylem. Actually, it's water use. Whereas the stress tree in April was similar to the non-stress tree. Then in May, it increased its water use significantly, then reduced it significantly in June, and in July it started to get very low. It started to move its peak sap flow from the morning to the afternoon and evening, and so during the summer had much lower water use than the non-stress tree. Now this is a year later, and an average between June and August, June, July, August, again over a day, and this is just averaged every day during these 3 months. We see again the non-stress tree. Water use goes up in the morning, peaks later in the morning, and then got reduced until the evening. The moderately stressed trees started much later, had a peak in the afternoon, and the severely stressed trees, we added another tree here, had very low water use over the summer. So this seems to be related to now the dendrometer measurements. This is the we have point dendrometers on the xylem, so we remove the bark and put the dendrometer on the xylem, and then one on top of the bark, and we can calculate changes over the day, again for June to August 2017, in the diameter of the xylem in green and of the bark in blue. So the non-stress tree here had a relatively low amplitude of diameter change. So in the morning, the diameter on the xylem was reduced a bit because water started to move and being lost by the canopy, and it rebounds in the evening. The stress trees, though, had a much larger amplitude, lost much more water from the xylem in the morning, and then in the evening had a much higher rebounding. The severely stressed tree did not have that high of rebounding. It probably had very low water amounts. And now the bark is interesting because the bark actually shows us capacitance of the stem, so the water storage in the parenchyma cells in the stem, and it shows a higher amplitude for the non-stress than for the stress trees, meaning that there's more water availability, there's more water available for the non-stress trees, that they can move from the bark to the xylem, or the parenchyma cells to the xylem, and so have a less restriction on the water flow in the xylem as compared to the stress trees. So we asked how is the adjustment of crown density actually regulated, and our findings here were that trees with very low crown density have values of water potential and stomatal conductance that were similar to trees with high crown density. But the non-stress trees seem to have more access to water in the soil rock system than the stress trees, and so seem to have sufficient internal water stores for enabling leaf gas exchange, such as transpiration under the dry summer conditions. And in the end, leaf area seems to be adjusted according to the tree's water status to prevent passing a threshold and passing a point of no return where mortality might actually be the fate of the tree in the end. So even that we have not seen significant differences really in the water potential of the trees, there still might be a threshold that or very small reduction in the water potential might trigger loss of leaf area to reduce the water being lost from the soil through the tree. Masha, okay. So we wanted to know then if the vulnerability to drought in oak trees, whether it is deducible from the species drought resistant strategy, and predicted that oaks have a less efficient drought resistant strategy than other woody species, and we made a comparison of oaks with Pistacia, Elatamastic, and Phillyrea, Barzite. And this was part of the PhD thesis of Päivi Venänen. I will not show a lot from this, but here we plotted midday water potential with against pre-dawn water potential for the three species over all the measurements that we did during 3.5 years. In blue, you see the winter values, in green, the spring values, and in red, the summer values. And we can immediately see that the water potential of the three species during winter and spring was more or less similar. But then in summer, oak and Pistacia had similar water potential levels, whereas Phillyrea had much lower water potential. Now we used these summer values and extrapolated them to the 1-to-1 line, so where midday water potential meets pre-dawn water potential, and to calculate the water potential when at stomatal closure. And this was similar to between these two species again, and neither of those species actually reached this water potential. As you can see here, minimum water potential was a bit lower than -4 megapascal, as compared to Phillyrea, which actually reached stomatal closure. It had a much lower water potential at stomatal closure, but the trees reached these values actually at the end of the summer. This is a summary of what we found. I just want to show that oak and Pistacia, they were very similar in, for example, the minimum water potential that we measured, and in the water potential at stomatal closure and so on. Whereas Phillyrea was very different, had much lower water potential and reached stomatal closure in the end. And then down here, we have the hydraulic safety margin, where we compare hydraulic parameters with the water potentials being measured, for example. Here, the minimum water potential as compared to the water potential that corresponds to 88% loss of conductivity. And we see that oak and Pistacia have similar hydraulic safety margins, and they were lower than the hydraulic safety margin of Phillyrea. And another point was the turgor loss point. Another issue was turgor loss point. On the y-axis, we have water potential at turgor loss point, and on the x-axis, pre-dawn leaf water potential. And we see that there is an adjustment of the turgor loss point over the seasons from December to January to May and to August. And we also see that here, this is the 1-to-1 line, that oaks and Pistacia do not cross this 1-to-1 line. So they did not reach turgor loss. Whereas Phillyrea definitely reached actually turgor loss. It reached this past the turgor loss point. Turgor loss point was at -4 megapascal in August, and the trees here reached below -6. So this is another very different strategy of these two species as compared to that species. And to summarize, Phillyrea uses what we call a more anhydrohydric strategy of water use. It actually seems to deplete the water in its root zone over the summer, and in the end reaches turgor loss point and closes its stomata. It might not have access to deep soil water, but it just dries out the water in its root zone, but seems to be very tolerant to drought. Whereas oaks and pistacia, they do not reach turgor loss point. They do not close their stomata, might have access to deeper water, so might have deeper roots, and use a more isohydric strategy of water use and drought resistance. Now, despite that these two species were very similar in their drought resistance strategy, their mortality rates were very different. We found in a survey we made in 2017, we found only 2% of dry pistacia shrubs, but we found 27% of dead oak plants. And this might possibly be related to the fact that pistacia shrubs are much lower than oak trees, have about 10% of a shrub volume as compared to the volume of the oak trees. So we asked whether the vulnerability to drought in oak trees is deducible from its drought resistance strategy, and this seems not to be the case because quercus, so oak and pistacia, had a very similar drought resistance strategy, but very different mortality rates. And Phileurea is a water spender, but is very drought resistant and tolerant. And so we could not find physiological traits that could be directly related to tree mortality. And it seems that oak mortality is a consequence of a combination of low water availability, low tolerance to extreme drought, and being a relatively large tree that consumes large amounts of water. So far to work in Ramat HaNadiv, and what we found about how the species regulates its water use through its leaf area, probably. We estimated that by crown density, and possibly triggered by a threshold of somewhere above -5 megapascal. Now here is our second topic, now in the southern Judean foothills, which, as I said, is the climate-based edge of oak distribution. And we asked whether livestock grazing could mitigate drought stress in oak trees. And the prediction was that grazing improves the tree's water nutrient status and promotes growth. And just in brackets, possibly or probably because of reduced competition from nearby vegetation and or improved soil properties. But we're not there yet to actually test these different mechanisms. Most of our work so far is related to vegetation. And this was a project started again by Päivi Venänen and forms now a big part of Omri Hasson's PhD thesis, again in collaboration with Vulcani Center. So the first project is, or the first study is, a long-term cattle grazing experiment in the Hazan Hills near Amatzia, where we have 6 large exclosures that were established in 2013, and you can see them on this map here. And it needs to be mentioned that this is one of the driest oak woodlands in Israel. It is a woodland with a lot of oaks, not just 1 or 2 oaks. And you can see here the effect of grazing. This is the exclosure. When there's no grazing, you have a lot of herbaceous vegetation, and this is the grazed area. And you can see the difference here. Importantly, we made pre-treatment evaluations and found that the groups of trees inside the exclosures and outside the exclosure did not differ in their size and in their water potential. So we have comparable sets of trees here. And what Henri found in 3 years of study so far, and here I show the water potential in the fall, so after the long dry season, and we can see that both pre-dawn and midday water potential was lower in the ungrazed than in the grazed trees, which means that the water status of the grazed trees is better than the water status of the ungrazed trees. The differences are small, but they are consistent throughout a dry year, an average year, a wet year, during pre-dawn and on midday. And this makes the treatment this makes the difference between the treatments actually highly significant. We did not find a difference in the isotopic signature of the leaves in delta C13, which is a long-term sort of measure of drought stress. We see that in the drier year, so 2018 was a dry year, as compared to 2019, which was a wetter year. We see that delta C13 was less negative in the dry year, which makes sense because there's less discrimination of C13 as compared to the wetter year, but no difference between the two treatments. Now, gas exchange in 2020 and 2020 was quite a wet year. It was a good year in terms of water balance. Stomatal conductance here, transpiration rate and net photosynthesis, once measured in winter in March and once measured in autumn in October. Morning measurements and midday measurements. Blue is grazed and red is ungrazed. And we see that in the morning measurements, there were higher rates and more open stomata in the ungrazed than in the grazed trees. And we see this for all variables and in both seasons. But then on midday, actually, it turned around and trees that were in the exclosures, so were not in the grazed area, had to reduce stomatal conductance, reduce transpiration, reduce photosynthesis, both in the winter and in the fall. So altogether, it seems that there were significant restrictions and constraints on the amount of water that was available to the trees, and they had to reduce on midday their leaf gas exchange. In terms of nutrients, we measured all kinds of nutrients, and I showed just a few here: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and so on. Some differences between years, no differences between grazing and non-grazing treatments. But in terms of growth, so we measured tree size in 2013 and again in 2020 in ungrazed and grazed plots. And we see that the trees that were in the exclosures grew in height by 25 centimeters, whereas trees that grew outside the exclosures, so were in the grazed area, grew 3 times more. And the same can be said or similar in terms of the crown area. So this is a top view, and you show this just a drawing of the crown area, which increased over these 7 years by 5 square meters, whereas in the grazed area, it increased by 12.5 square meters. So these are statistically significantly more growth in the grazed than in the ungrazed area. And do I have time a little bit? Just another setup of experimental sites used a small precipitation gradient in the Judean foothills 3 sites in Park Britannia, 3 sites near Lachish, and 3 sites in the Amatzia region. And they were different in grazing intensities. Actually, Omri went on and quantified the grazing intensity for each single tree. So we could see here the tree dimensions in the different regions and in all the sites together, where we can see that with increasing intensity of grazing, the trees were higher and the trees had a larger crown area. So the trees altogether were larger in when they were under more grazing or had more grazing around them, and on the trees themselves. The cattle also browses a bit on the new leaves on the trees themselves, as compared to the trees that had very low grazing intensity. In terms of water of delta C13, no grazing effect. Some difference between the regions, but we cannot say much more about this at this point. I would like to summarize this study. So we asked whether livestock grazing mitigates drought stress in oak trees. And we've seen so far that tree water status, according to water potential and the behavior of leaf gas exchange, appears to be slightly but consistently improved by grazing. We saw an increased growth rate of trees in grazed and in ungrazed plots. We see that when we compare different grazing intensities, that tree size increased, and did not find any difference between the trees in terms of their nutrient status. So, to very shortly conclude, Quercus caliprinus reduces its leaf area and its water use with increasing drought, and this is possibly triggered by a threshold of water potential. This is from our work in Ramat HaNadiv. And the grazing can alleviate drought stress in oak trees and can promote growth. And this is from our work in the Judean foothills. So the take-home messages would be, according to those studies with the oaks on the edge, so lithology edge and climate edge, climate change-induced drought will most probably negatively affect these trees, which are key components of natural woodlands in Israel. And this has also meanings for other Mediterranean regions where oaks are a very important component of these natural forests. Now, grazing might be a tool to save some of the oaks from climate change, but we know that trees do not only need to be saved from climate change, also from direct human impacts through infrastructure development. For example, there are in this southernmost region around Amatzia, there are only about 300 mature oak trees left there. And still some of them, or quite a lot of them, are being felled for development and for housing and so on. So yeah, we should save trees from climate change, but we should first make sure that the few trees that are still left in the southern region will not be removed for development. And with this, I would like to acknowledge lab members, Baby that finished her PhD, Omri Hasson, who is now conducting his PhD, Yakir, who finished, Levi, who helped with the gas exchange measurements, and of course Rita, which helps with everything in the lab, and a lot of field and lab helpers, and our collaborators in the Agricultural Research Organization, Yagil Osem and Shabtai Cohen, and some help we got from Ori Achiman. Of course, Ramat HaNadiv Nature Park, Yael Navon and Liat Hadar, and Tamir Klein and Lido Rock for the isotope measurements, and they are from the Weizmann Institute. And different funding sources, Ramat Nadiv, KKL, and the Ministry of Science, and then a new project with Hohenheim in the Faculta Hohenheim collaboration project. And so in the future, we will also see contributing by our collaborator at Hohenheim for this project. So thank you very much.
Thank you, José, for the lecture. And if there are any questions, please ask them.
Yeah, I have a few comments. Okay, you hear me?
Sure.
Hi.
Nice.
Great. It was a great lecture, Jose. I learned a lot from your lecture. Thanks.
Thank you.
So it would seem that like the oaks in Ramat Nadiv, let's say one severe drought event, all the oaks in Ramat Nadiv, let's say if we have 1 year with, let's say, I don't know, 20% rain or something like that, could potentially be disastrous. And the second comment is about this, let's say, adjustment of, let's say, some leaf-specific hydraulic conductance according to the access to water, right? And this is done actively by the tree. But what you're showing is that if we increase the pruning, if we have some external pruning by grazing, or let's say, if it would be by management, then we could also improve the health of the trees. Let's say if we anticipate that next year is going to be a drought year, right?
Yeah.
These are two comments.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for these comments. Yeah, I should mention that work being done by Gabi Schiller and probably by you as well, Shabtai, where this in Ramat Nadiv, the stems, and I think in other places, these oaks are multi-stemmed oaks, and when they reduced the amount of stems to just one stem, then this greatly improved the condition of the tree, allowed to save some water, and the one stem that was left was in better condition. So yes, in theory, pruning the tree and removing some of the stems could be a management tool to save some of these trees, but this is very labor intensive and is not commonly being practiced. Now, it still might be something to save trees on where they are rather rare, like in Ramat Nadiv and like in these very southern areas where we do not have many trees.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Jose.
Hi, Tamir.
Thank you for this very important talk. The difference between the Quercus and Pistacia in terms of mortality rate is intriguing. Unlike what you showed, the drought resistance is quite similar. Do you think it's related to root system? And this also relates to your other project with the grazing. I think there might be the roots of the oak are too deep even to compete with the grasses. And we know that the Pistacia have very dominant shallow roots. Do you know anything about the root systems or how they affect what you observed?
I have no idea about the root system. I think the only one who has a better understanding of the root system is you. Well, we know that these oak trees, and we know from Nia Hale's work that these oak trees have very deep root systems, can reach water sources deep in the rock, but two things about this. Once there needs to be water there. If there's no water there, then it doesn't help that they have a deep root system. And then still, I mean, it seems from our work in the Judean foothills that if there is a competition issue, right, we do not know yet whether the improvement of the water conditions by grazing is related to reduced competition between oaks and all the other plants that are being reduced by grazing, or something through the changes in the soil properties. We have not looked yet into the soil properties because this, for this, you need a dedicated project to deeply look into this. But still, I mean, if we accept that maybe some of the changes that were made to improve the water status of the trees by grazing is by reducing vegetation. Now, most other species have a more shallow root system. Definitely the herbaceous biomass, the herbaceous plants have a more shallow root system, and then some of the shrubs there also. So it still seems to be important, or seems to be still be possible to improve the water status of the trees by reducing the amount of vegetation that has only shallow roots. So the shallow roots still have an importance, not only the deep roots. And we know from actually every species has most of its roots in the top layer, top 30 or top 50 centimeters, whether it is an oak or it is a pine or whatever it is. Most of the roots are in the shallow upper part of the soil. And then the trees that have to survive summer need to have some deeper roots where they can get some water when there's no water in the upper layer anymore. Unless olives or Phillyrea, which seems to be very, very tolerant to very high degrees of drought.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Just a question, when you talk about grazing, is it goats or cows or combination?
No, it was cattle. I indicated it, yeah, several times. It was cattle grazing. In this region, there's mostly cattle grazing. There are some sheep also, but we do not mix those because different species could have different impacts. So we better go with cattle. Even cattle, I mean, it depends. It still depends. Different ages of cows have different impacts in that region where we have the exclosures. These are young cows. The ones that are that still did not give birth. How you call them? I don't know. So not small calves, but larger, and they behave differently and move differently in the field than cows which have calves already.
מבקירות, בתור רפתנית לשעבר.
תודה רבה. So yes, we should not mix the different types of livestock and have to live with different behaviors, even if we're just talking about one species.
I'll ask another question. I see we have another minute or two. This phenomenon of sap flow in the stressed trees being higher in the afternoon is something that I'm not so familiar with. Do you have an explanation? Usually when we have stress, let's say like in Yatif forest, we find a peak of sap flow early in the day. We have this high activity early in the day, and then later on they close the stomata, which we understand is that they've had access maybe to water over the night. They filled up some capacity, and then they use it quickly in the morning when water use efficiency is high, and then they shut down. So I was wondering if you have some insight into what you found in the stress trees of the increase in the afternoon.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. We could speculate, right, that maybe the refill during the night was not enough, and to actually sustain water movement through the stem in the morning, and that there was some water filling still going on, which then led to higher sap flow in the afternoon. Now, trees often in our region have a peak of gas exchange, leaf gas exchange in the morning and in the afternoon, and a midday depression. So this could be one of the options, but I don't have a better explanation right now for this phenomenon. But it seems to be only in this moderately stressed tree, whereas the severely stressed tree that just downregulated everything.
Yeah, the severely stressed tree was what maybe we'd expect, either an early peak or a plateau that you had in the severely stressed. But the moderately stressed was strange. How many trees were in that?
No. This is only one tree. Mm-hmm. One, we had, one non-stressed, one moderately stressed, and one severely stressed tree. Yeah, right. So this could be a coincidence, right?
Okay.
Just a question that I have: how stress was defined? Like how was it categorized? Like high or low?
Yeah, good question. Well, by the crown density. So by the impression that first we started just with the impression that we got from what the trees looks like, and then together with Yael Lavon, which is here, hi Yael, we came up with a way to quantify that. So we quantify crown density in steps of 5%, and do this according to pictures that we produced. And this is a well known way, simple way that foresters use in other parts of the world. And so we just applied this method, took pictures, and then had a sort of a scale of 100% down to maybe 10 or 5% of crown density, and always the tree that is being assessed needs to be compared to the pictures. So this is something that where you calibrate yourself constantly. Right, Yael? Yeah. Okay. So it is simple, but we still find that this could still be the most practical way to do it, rather than use any type of remote sensing or close sensing or whatever, in terms of taking pictures and then analyzing them and so on. Maybe the vision would be in the end to use any type of picture, either from planet or from something else. But for this, you have then to identify single trees from space or from a UVA or something else. UAV, unmanned.
Do I have time for another comment? Okay, nobody's stopping me. I always suspect, and I've never been able to prove it or anything, that the crown density that we have, or let's say the very large leaf area index in some of these trees, is really a strategy for competition in order to shade out competitors underneath. So I wonder if you have a lower crown density. So in the case of grazing, so the grazers take care of everything underneath and there's no problem with competition. But once you get to when you have reduced crown density in the oak tree in Ramat Nadiv, maybe you have some competitors.
Yeah,
Maybe
definitely.
that would be what would explain, let's say, the strange sap flow graph, that they're grabbing the water in the morning, the competitors. Maybe there's filaria or something growing together with the roots of the oak.
Yeah, definitely there is competition. There is harsh competition for space and for resources. The grazers do not necessarily take care of everything under the tree. They might not have access to plants under the tree, but so even where there is grazing, there might be competition, definitely with other woody species. And we clearly see that once the canopy gets less dense, you have other species coming up around and from and even under the canopy. And on top of that, climbers. We definitely see that when the canopy gets less dense, the climbers start to increase in leaf area in these trees. It gets to the point that when a tree loses all its leaves, the climbers get so dominant and so heavy, they in the end crush the tree underneath them. So competition is definitely an issue which we might need to look much more into.
I think it's already 10. Thank you very much, José. I'm sure that if there are more questions, José will be happy to accept them in different forms. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you, José, for the lecture. And don't forget, José has a different lecture this week for the PIs in the faculty. And next week, April 11, it's going to be Asaf Chen from Igal, talking a little bit about UAVs in agriculture. So thank you very much and have a great week.
תודה רבה. ביי ביי.